Today, I'm looking at the dangerous and inhumane prisons iceberg. At the surface level of this iceberg chart, we actually have some really nice prisons, which were interesting to look at and find out about, but you're going to want to stay around to the end for this one, because as we get to the bottom of the chart, the prisons featured get really quite disturbing. Bastøy prison's in Norway, and it's probably one of the nicest prisons in the world. Everyone on the island lives like they're in a small community, and they all work, but in their free time they can do activities like bike ride, fish, and even swim in the sea. Every man has their own room in a 6-bedroom style looking house, and they have a shared kitchen and bathroom, and it has by far the lowest reoffending rate in the world. HMP Addiewell. HMP Addiewell is a men's prison in Scotland, and violence is rife. I came across many articles saying that guards turn a blind eye to illegal activity, and with drug overdoses being a huge problem in Scotland already, in this prison that's no different. There's also claims that gangs just run the prison, and over lockdown, prisoners actually took control of a whole wing. It's basically a prison in Scotland full of Scottish mad lads doing things that Scottish mad lads do. Justice Centre Le Bon. Justice Centre Le Bon is a prison in Austria. It doesn't just look nice from the outside, it is obviously clearly super modern and luxurious. Prisoners can also take part in lots of tasks. There's a basketball court, there's a school there which looks super modern, and the prison only has 205 inmates. And because resources are well spent, again, reoffending rates are super low. Aranjuez in Spain. The unique thing about this prison, it actually allows families to stay together. So if you were to offend, end up in prison, then your wife and your child can actually come and stay in the prison with you. I mean, it's great, I suppose, for children that would otherwise have to grow up without a father, but the idea of a whole family living in a prison together is kind of strange, but why not? Champ d'Olonne. Champ d'Olonne is in Switzerland, and it's basically Swiss's biggest prison. Now, I'm not quite sure why this one's on the list, but it's interesting to note that 80% of the prisoners are foreign. So the crime rate being super low in Switzerland, I suppose all the prisoners that come and commit crime in Switzerland are foreign people looking to take advantage of the country's wealth. I suppose if you were a cat burglar, Switzerland would be an ideal place to move. Not that I'm giving advice to any cat burglars that might happen to be out there. Going down to the second tier of the iceberg, this is where we start to get a little bit inhumane, but these ones are very famous prisons that we all know. Alcatraz. We all know it. The lighthouse, the fort, started off as a military prison, and then in 1934 it became a federal prison. And it officially closed in 1963, which of course is now a major tourist attraction. I've actually been, and it's great, it's very interesting. It's famously known for being almost impossible to escape, and if you're a Call of Duty fan, the best Warzone map is based on Alcatraz. Only 3 people have ever escaped, brothers John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris. However, they've never been found, so they well could have escaped and then drowned at sea, and then their bodies were never found. But out of 36 attempts in 30 years, 23 people were caught, 6 were shot, and the rest drowned. Gulags. Now obviously, a gulag isn't a particular prison. They're the prisons that the Soviet Union used, and also, if you've seen Stranger Things, it's the type of prison that Hopper is locked up in and expected to do work. Gulags were set up to inhabitate large parts of remote Russia, which ultimately resulted in the purging of peasants and kulaks. Basically capitalists. And then, of course, it just ended up being a prison for anyone that was against the government. Gulags were essentially forced labor camps where prisoners would build such things like railroads that would power the industry for Russia, but they turned out to be too expensive for Russia to use. Socialism. I could make a whole video on the Gulag system, so subscribe and maybe that'll come in the future. San Quentin State Prison. San Quentin is the oldest prison in California, and it also has the largest death row gas chamber, but they've only used lethal injection since 1996. It's featured many notable inmates, including Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, Danny Trejo, and Charles Manson. The Tombs. The Tombs is an alternative name for the Manhattan Detention Center, and there was rumors it was designed to look like an Egyptian tombs. It was built over the top of a pond that was drained and eventually landfilled, making conditions super unsanitary. Charles Dickens visited the prison and wrote, "Such indecent and disgusting dungeons as these cells would bring disgrace upon any of the most despotic empires." In the third tier, we also have some prisons that you've definitely heard of, but also some ones you probably haven't. the inhumaneness just ramps up a notch. Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, also known as Gitmo, opened after 9/11. In 2002, the Bush administration built Guantanamo Bay in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It was built to detain, quote, extraordinarily dangerous people. There's reports of torture and sexual abuse, detaining minors, and I'm sure breaking many other international laws, often locking people away with no trial or hearing. A particularly famous case was from 2004, known as the Tipton Three, where 3 British citizens were released back to the UK after being in Gitmo for 4 months. In this short space of time, they reported abuse, long periods of isolation, sexual degradation, forced drugging, which led to the men giving false confessions. Upon release back to the UK, I think the men were released with no charge in hours. So famously, the police will not do deals with terrorists, but there's been many reports from Gitmo that prisoners have been released to Al-Qaeda and various other terrorist organizations for a bounty. It's basically a shady prison for the CIA and the US government to do shady stuff that we're less likely to find out about.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
Rikers Island. Rikers Island is the main prison for New York City. It's 400 acres and has seen some famous inmates such as Sid Vicious Tupac and Mark Dave Chapman, the guy who killed John Lennon. It's due to close in 2026 as it's built on a toxic wasteland, so, they could probably make improvements there. It's known for being very corrupt, reports of officers selling drugs and even knives to inmates. Being so close to LaGuardia Airport in 1957, a plane crashed into the island. Inmates ran to the crash site to help. As a result, 30 of these prisoners were released. 16 of them had their sentences reduced. Salvador Dali also had a piece of art where he gifted to the prison in 1965. It was moved to the prison lobby for safekeeping in 1981. However, in 2003 it was stolen and replaced with a fake. 3 guards were caught and charged, although the painting was never found. Interestingly as well, until 2018, juveniles were housed with the main adult population of the prison. Terre Haute. Now, most inmates sentenced to death in America apparently end up here. It's in Indiana. The prison has a huge 4-story discipline and death row segregation building, and one of the most famous prisoners to end up in Terre Haute was the Oklahoma City bomber. He was actually executed there. The Attica Correction Facility. Attica's in New York State, and in the 30s it held most of the most dangerous convicts of all time. The prison is famous for a riot in 1971 in which inmates took control of the prison for 7 days. Prisoners were looking to negotiate with the state over bad conditions and overcrowding. When the state came in and retook control, 43 people died. Gunfire killed 9 hostage correctional officers, 30 prisoners, and 1 guard was killed on the day of the uprising. La Santé. La Santé, of course you might have guessed, is a prison in France. It features a VIP area to house special inmates, including recently Jean-Luc Brunel, who was a model agent that used to supply girls to Jeffrey Epstein. Conveniently, he was found hanging in his cell on the 19th of February 2022. The prisons also include many French celebrities, including poets of the past and rappers of the present, and even a few presidents. The prisons also see many executions, the very last in 1972, by France's favourite method. Yep, you've guessed it, the guillotine. In the year 2000, the prison's head doctor, Véronique Vasseur, published a book on the prison where poor conditions were reported, leading to the government evaluating the prison. In 2014, the prison was closed for renovations and is still not fully open. Folsom. Folsom, made famous by Johnny Cash, opened in 1880, and prisoners would spend most of their time in the dark, behind solid boilerplate doors and stone cell walls. The 4 by 8 foot steel doors were complete with a 6-inch eye slat, and air holes weren't installed until 1940. These doors are still used today. One of the more interesting escape stories from Folsom Prison was from 1932, where someone crafted a diving suit out of footballs. This guy only got so far though, as the guards had to drain a nearby pond and received his body from the bottom. Nowadays the prison's known for being really violent due to gang clashes. Being so close to the Mexican border, a large amount of Mexican gang members end up in Folsom. Vladimir Central Prison. Vladimir Central is Russia's largest prison by capacity. It was built by the Russian Empire back in 1783, and it doesn't seem like much has changed since then. Overcrowded, riddled with disease, and abuse and torture. This 2008 letter, written by an inmate with his own blood, made it out of the prison. He speaks in the letter about fearing for his own life. During the Soviet era, it became a political prison. just like I'm sure most prisons were in Russia. Gdani. Gdani is a prison in Georgia, the country, not the state, and it was involved in a huge scandal in 2012, where videos were leaked showing torture and sexual abuse of detainees. The video leaks were timely, as they became 2 weeks before a parliamentary election. The unique situation in Georgia was huge news, and it spread via social media rather than the state-run news channels. It sparked huge protests across the nation, forcing a number of government employees to resign. In these leaked videos, you can see prisoners raped with broomsticks, smashed with batons, stripped naked, and spat on. The government in charge while this abuse was going on, the United National Movement, lost that election by a landslide to the Georgian Dream Coalition. The new government promised to improve these prison conditions, and in 2013 they actually cut the prison population down in half, from 24,000 to 12,000. Tent City Prison. If anyone's viewing from America, you might have heard of this. I don't know if it's just because I'm British, I've never heard of this, but this one's crazy, and I'm actually going to make a whole video about this. So the Tent City was in Phoenix, Arizona. The prison was opened by Joe Arpaio, known as America's toughest sheriff.
You like the food?
No.
It's vegetarian, I changed it.
It sucks doing it.
Why are you complaining?
I'm just saying the food.
You committed a crime,
Yeah,
right? You've been convicted.
yeah.
He constantly bragged about it in the media, being like a concentration camp. Despite lawsuits from ex-prisoners, public outcry, and even criticism from Amnesty International, calling it inhumane, overcrowded, and dangerous, it remained open until 2017. As I said, subscribe and you might see a whole video about this prison in the future. On to the fourth layer of the iceberg. Now, I hadn't heard of most of these prisons, I actually don't think I'd heard of any, and yeah, our conditions are getting pretty poor now, but stay tuned for the next two as we have some really inhumane prisons in there. Kamiti Maximum Security. Kamiti is in Nairobi, Kenya, built on 1,200 acres of land. It was built for 1,400 inmates, but currently houses over 3,600. It has no running water system. For a place that houses over 3,600 people to not have running water, you can imagine what kind of conditions they're living in. Bucheka. Bucheka is in Russia. Again, no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, but let's go with it. It's built like a castle, as it was built by the Russian Empire, and in Soviet times, it was a camp transfer for people being sent to gulags. Overcrowding has been a huge issue, with 100 inmates staying in cells that were built for 10. To prevent diseases spreading around the prison, they'll pile people up with diseases such as AIDS or tuberculosis in the same cells as each other. But this would be ineffective, as during bus transfer of prisoners, the tuberculosis would be rife. Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir is in Turkey, and the early 1980s in this prison were known as the period of barbarity. The prison was built for political prisoners during the Ottoman Empire. After a military coup in Turkey abolished the parliament and banned most human rights organisations, 30,000 men and women were jailed in the first 4 months after the coup. Over the following years, Amnesty International have received thousands of complaints of torture and allegedly over 100 deaths as a result of torture. There's a huge racial issue in the prison against Kurdish people, and all prisoners are forced to sing Turkish national songs daily, in order to make Kurdish people Turkified. Guards would use code when talking about torture, and refer to extreme methods of torture as the disco. The guards even trained a German Shepherd to attack people at the genitals, and even though now Turkey have a parliamentary system back, we still see many reports that torture and inhumane conditions remain to this day. Black Dolphin. Black Dolphin is in Russia, and it gets its name from the sculpture outside the prison that was built by inmates. It dates back to 1745, and prisoners are all serving life sentences. It includes some of Russia's worst prisoners, including child molesters, murderers, serial killers, terrorists, and even cannibals. Prisoners spend all day in their cells, about 90 minutes a day for exercise and searching. There's no resting or sitting on the bunks until bed. 16 hours a day must be spent standing. Every 15 minutes, prisoners are subject to cell checks, and their diet is soup 4 times a day, every day. P&M Prison. Penitentiary in New Mexico is in New Mexico, and it was opened in 1885. In 1903, it became the first US prison to force prisoners into building highways. Reminds me of some other prisons we looked at. The prison's seen a few riots in its time, including the 1980 two-day riot. It ended in 33 inmates' deaths and 12 officers being held prisoner. During the riot, men were butchered, dismembered, decapitated, hung, and even burnt alive. The Arthur Road Jail. The Arthur Road Jail, also known as the Mumbai Central Prison, was built to accommodate 800 prisoners in a city with a population of 21 million people. That's insane. In 2001, it had an average population of 2,900, and the prison's known for having massive gang wars, that they try and segregate the rival gangs into different parts of the prison. Muhanga. Muhanga is a prison in Rwanda built in 1973 to accommodate 750 inmates. But after the genocide of 94, the prison now holds at least 6,000 inmates. To help with the huge population problem, guards have been known to kill off prisoners using methods such as starvation, dehydration, and maybe worst of all, housing the most insane prisoners with large cells with the most well-behaved prisoners. Knowing that the clinically insane prisoner would have easy pickings, allowing them to kill their well-behaved cellmates. Between 2014 and 2018, more than 500 men died in just one wing of the prison. British and Dutch authorities have tried to visit the prison, but when they visit, they're only allowed to look at certain wings. Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay is in California and is a very large new prison. Has a population of 18,052 people, while the capacity is 2,380, so finally a prison that's not overpopulated. In 1989, guards forced inmates into gladiatorial style fights.
Are you not entertained?
One prisoner who covered his cell in shit was bathed in water so hot that he ended up getting third-degree burns from the bath. In 1993, media attention led to a judge ruling that the prison should have oversight by a prison rights lawyer. The prison has seen a number of mass hunger strikes in protest of the conditions. In 2012, it was found that a group of 10 men had been housed in solitary confinement for 11 to 22 years. In 2015, California agreed to end this unlimited isolation policy. Only prisoners who would commit crimes while in prison can be sent to solitary, only for a maximum of 5 years. These long isolation periods that prisons use to separate the most troublesome prisoners are so damaging. They've been proved to send people clinically insane. San Pedro Prison. San Pedro is in Bolivia and is essentially a well-running society inside the prison. Inmates work jobs, but can even buy and rent different accommodation, and even live with their families. There are 3,000 convicted inmates, not including family members that live with inmates. The facility has elected leaders who set their own laws. Now, the prison was designed to house 600 people, so it's well overpopulated, hence that the cells get bought and rented out. There are 8 different sections to the prison, each has its own class system. High end for families, and the low end of the prison is for people like drug addicts. La Posta is the name of the high end area of the prison. It includes private bathrooms, kitchens, TVs, and even some cells having 3 floors. One inmate even built an extension to his cell, giving him skyline views of the city and a rooftop hot tub. If you wanted to buy a cell, then it would be around $20 for a cheap cell in the poorer areas with the drug addicts, and could be up to $5,000 for a top property with multiple floors. The prison guards just patrol the border of the prison. They have absolutely no authority inside. As we move on to the 5th level of the iceberg, we're seeing more inhumaneness and general government cover-ups of how they treat their prisoners. Penal del Ciudad Barrios. The Penal del Ciudad Barrios is a prison in El Salvador. The prison was built in 2004 with the sole purpose of housing members of one particular gang, the Mara Salvatierra. The military serves guards in this prison. It has a capacity of 800, yet houses 2,500 prisoners. Again, with poverty being a huge issue in El Salvador, there's only one guard for every 50 prisoners in the prison, and prisoners basically have full control of the prison. Now, this one here that just says Nairobi prison, I feel like this may be a mistake. I think it's the committee maximum security, which we've already gone over in the previous section. So I'm not just ignoring this one. I genuinely don't know what just Nairobi on its own is. Drapchi prison, or Lhasa. It means 4 corners, and it's the largest prison in Tibet, China. It was originally a military base until in 1959, the Tibetan uprising. It became a prison for mainly political prisoners. This prison gets really bad press because of who the prisoners actually are. They're monks. Peaceful monks, right? And being monks, they're probably more than happy to just live in a prison and own nothing and have nothing. But that's not the point. They shouldn't be in a prison against their own will. They should be able to have nothing and own nothing while being free. Bang Kwang. Bang Kwang's in Thailand and has Thai's only death row. It has a population of 6,000 people and locked away lots of foreigners due to Thai's harsh laws. Before 2013, all prisoners would have to wear leg irons, and death row prisoners would have these irons welded to their legs. Alan John Davis was the first foreign man put on death row in this prison for heroin trafficking. In 1995, the British Embassy said that their evidence contained worrying irregularities, and it was probably a miscarriage of justice. After years of battling, eventually, Alan John Davis was freed in 2007, 17 years later. La Modelo. La Modelo is a large prison in Bogota, Colombia. It has a population of 11,000 people. The prison is split up by its wings, with one wing containing left-wing rebels and the south wing containing right-wing government supporters. Middle parts of the prison, when prisoners have to come together, often stage political wars, with guns and even grenades being used by prisoners. In 2016, dismembered remains of 100 people were found in drain pipes at the jail, and it's still pretty much a mystery as to how they got there, why they were there, or who the people even were. El Rodeo Prison. El Rodeo Prison in Venezuela has another huge overcrowding problem. It has double the population of its capacity. It's seen crazy violence, including a 2011 standoff lasting for 2 weeks, leaving 22 people dead. This sparked gang wars, with the prisoners being able to use an arsenal of AK-47s, AR-15s, and even a 50 caliber anti-air gun. Mamertine. Mamertine was an ancient Roman prison, dating back to the 7th century BC. It was a dungeon or a slave camp, and there was never any trials. People that ended up in this prison were mostly always executed. It remains a church now, and many Catholics see this prison as a holy site. St. Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, would apparently perform baptisms here for prisoners before his crucifixion. Prisoners would stay in a single cell in complete isolation. Black Beach Prison. Black Beach Prison is in Equatorial Guinea. It was built in the 1940s during Spanish colonialism. But after independence in 1968, dictator Francisco Macias Nguema took over and imprisoned many of his political enemies, including previous Prime Minister Bonifacio Ondor Eddy. Officially, he committed suicide, but it's reported to be a bit of an Epstein situation, so who really knows? Over the years, it's remained a political prison, housing mainly mercenaries from a 2004 coup attempt against Francisco's son, Fedoro Obiang Nguema Masogo. I think I nailed that. Anyone who goes against the government in Equatorial Guinea essentially gets locked up here, and seemingly tortured. Equatorial Guinea being a dictatorship, not much is known about this prison, hence why it's quite far down on the list. Mendoza Prison. Mendoza Prison in Argentina has 1,600 inmates, but a capacity of only 600. Prisoners have to sleep on the floor, and most prisoners just resort to violence, as the prison is reported to be in a state of lockdown most of the time. Prison protests have included hunger strikes, but due to prisoners being force-fed, many have been known to sew their mouths shut. 5 prisoners in this prison would share a 4x4 meter cell, have a toilet that is a plastic bag or a bottle of water, and cleaning only happens once a week. So you can only imagine what conditions are like. ADX Florence. ADX Florence is a supermax opened in Colorado in '94. It has a capacity for 551 prisoners, but currently has way under that with around 341. ADX Florence has never been full. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day in concrete cells and are on constant 24-hour monitoring. In 2012, 11 inmates filed a lawsuit against the prison for chronic abuse and failure to diagnose seriously mentally ill prisoners. As I touched on earlier, there are many scientific studies that say extended periods in solitary can destroy some people's mental health, let alone someone that's already struggling. One unit, Unit H, even blocks prisoners from speaking with journalists, family, and lawyers. These prisoners are known as having SAMs against them, which is a special administrative measure. In 2020, the US wanted to put Julian Assange in Assam, which would have probably meant he ended up in ADX Florence. Thankfully, British magistrates blocked this extradition due to concern of his mental health. However, in 2021, Julian Assange was extradited back to the US after an appeal in the British High Court. The decision to send him to the US was made on the ground that he wouldn't be subject to Assam or put in ADX Florence, which is some good news, but I can't see Julian Assange talking to a journalist anytime soon, or in fact ever. Prisoners include Al-Qaeda members, including the 9/11 planners, also Robert Hansen, who is a CIA/KGB double agent. El Chapo is in ADX Florence, and so is Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Okay, we're on to the second bottom area of this iceberg. Now these are essentially just the worst prisons that you would ever want to be in, some of them still open today. Gitama Prison. Gitama Prison is another prison in Rwanda. Amnesty International suggests that there are 7,500 prisoners, but the prison has a capacity of 3,000. It's similar to Mahanga, where after the genocide in 94, things really started going downhill because of overpopulation. It's reported dozens of people are dying every day, and the bodies don't go to waste. With lack of food, cannibalism is rife inside the prison. The Rwandan government will deny this, but between the years 94 and 95, 1,000 people died in the prison. Tadma Prison. Tadma is in Syria, so we can only imagine what a Syria prison can be like, as they're a very closed off country. However, it's very synonymous with death, torture, horror, and madness. The prison features mainly political enemies against the dictator Hafiz al-Assad. So after a failed assassination attempt in 1980, Assad's brother flew from Damascus to the prison and ordered soldiers to open cell doors and start shooting prisoners from cell to cell. No one knows how many people were killed, but it's estimated between 500 and 1,000 prisoners lost their life in a matter of minutes. Most prisoners are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, the suspected group behind this assassination. Inmates are beaten down and abused in Tadmor prison. They're stuck in confined cells, watched all day, and they're not allowed to move a muscle. They must look down, can't raise their heads, and cannot raise their hands. After release, many prisoners have reported it's taken them years to even regain eye contact with people. Upon arrival, you would go through what the guards would call the reception party. This involved climbing inside a car tire and having your feet whipped between 200 and 400 times. In May of 2015, the first pictures of the prison came out. They were actually released by ISIS. ISIS found the prison, freed the Muslim Brotherhood, and decided to blow it up. San Juan de Lugancho. I'm not going to try and say that again. But this prison's in Peru and has a population of 14,000 people and a capacity of 3,000. Again, being in a third world country, the crime bosses pretty much run this prison, and it's impossible for the guards to regain control. Around half the prisoners in this prison haven't even had a trial, as in the 1980s, when America were really pushing the war on drugs, Peru agreed to give out 30-year sentences for small drug charges in exchange for economical aid from the US. As a result, we have the mass population crisis that we see in this prison now. Camp 22, also known as Huryong Concentration Camp. Camp 22 is in North Korea, so not much is known about this prison apart from what we've been able to see from satellite images. A former prison guard, An Myong-chol, likened prisoners to skeletons and also called them cripples in rags. Thousands of prisoners had missing limbs but were still forced to work. The prisoners get 2 meals a day, both being 180 grams of corn each time. This reportedly resulted in 2,000 people dying from malnutrition every year. The children in the prison would work as farmers, while the elderly did the same work as the adults, such as mining. Work would go from 5 AM all the way through to 8 PM, followed by education on the Supreme Leader.
Do you think that margaritas are gay because they are so sweet?
Did someone tell you that? That margaritas are gay?
No, it's just a question I have.
If someone gets ill in the prison, they're simply quarantined and abandoned. The whistleblowing guard also reported torture, including people being hung upside down and then beaten, putting in a box room in pure isolation for a week, and being forced to kneel down with a wooden bar between your knee hollows. This would cut circulation in your legs and could go on for up to a whole week. It would result in many never being able to walk again. In 2012, it was reported that almost 30,000 people died from starvation in a really short period of time. This caused just a few thousand prisoners to be left, and it's reported they were transported elsewhere, so some say the prison's now closed. Carandiru Penitentiary. Carandiru is in Brazil, and in 1920 it was called the Sao Paulo House of Detention. In 1956 to 2002, it was South America's largest prison, and has a population of 8,000 people. A physician volunteered in the prison and encountered the rife AIDS epidemic from 89 to 2001. They wrote a book about their experience, which later was made into a Hollywood film. The film's critically acclaimed, called Carandiru, the same name as the prison. After the film and the book, there was so much backlash against the prison that the prison was demolished in 2002. But one block was left and is a museum to this day. In 1992, there was a huge massacre in the prison. On Friday the 2nd of October at around 1:30, two groups got into a knife fight over a game of football. This knife fight quickly escalated into a whole prison riot that lasted for 3 hours. The riot broke out into the prison yard and around 2,000 prisoners were skirmishing against 15 guards. At around 2:15 PM, the military were called, and upon arrival 15 minutes later, they assumed full command of the prison. The prison director is said to have wanted to talk to the prisoners via a megaphone to try and calm them down. However, the military knows best. The army came in and the prisoners were all stripped naked and locked in their cells by the army while being rounded up by dogs. Many were killed by the savage police dogs, while others once in their cells were shot. Wounded prisoners from the original skirmish had taken themselves to the prison barbershop for cover and for treatment. Police would then release these savage dogs into the barbershop to go after the injured. 111 people were found dead by the end of the day, and another 37 were injured. Ballistic evidence shows that 515 bullets were fired, and most of the gunshot wounds were in the head and chest. Many bodies were found with their hands in front of their faces or behind their heads. Brazil as a country was shocked by the massacre, and in 2000, international courts got involved, leading to the closure of the prison in 2001. In 2013 and 2014, 99 prison officers were sentenced to life in prison for the murder of many inmates. However, they're feds. So in 2016, the Brazilian courts declared that the trial was null, and they all acted in self-defense. So no one's ever been convicted, ever served time in jail. Prosecutors from the United Nations are still fighting. Sednaya prison. Sednaya is another prison in Syria. Since the start of the Syrian civil war, 30,000 people have died from torture inside the prison. Amnesty International say between 2011 and 2015, 5,000 to 13,000 people were executed. Many inmates are locked up for simply being involved in peaceful protests. Upon arrival to the prison, many have reported an ultimatum: be executed themselves or kill someone that was protesting alongside them. Cannibalism is also reported in the prison, along with all the methods of torture that we've already spoken about. 75% of people to go into Sednaya prison end up dying. One of the reported incidents involves a massacre from 2008. Guards tore up pages of the Quran and threw them all over the prison, causing fury amongst many Muslim prisoners. Prisoners scurried to collect the damaged pages, but were brutally shot, ending in 9 dead. Urga prison. Urga prison is an old prison from Mongolia. The prison literally featured small wooden houses, poorly built, maybe just well enough to keep wind out. And then inside these houses would stand wooden boxes, 4 foot by 2.5 foot. You can't stand up, you can't sit down, and you can't lie. You'd have a 6-inch hole for feeding and to get in a little bit of light. And waste would only be cleaned from your box every 2 to 3 weeks. With no ability to use your body, many would shrivel away and die. You can only imagine the awful drawn-out torture you would experience dying in one of these boxes. Not being able to move, barely being able to eat, probably not even wanting to drink. During the winter, it was also common for prisoners to freeze to death. The box of death was banned in 1920, but even though conditions may have improved, Amnesty International still says conditions are inhumane, with torture, starvation, still common in the prison today. Camp 139. Camp 139 is a secret prison in Israel. Very little is known about it. The prison was not public information until 2003. Although most of the information about the prison is still classified, the whole existence of the prison would probably still be classified today if it wasn't discovered by accident by an Israeli historian studying old British police compounds used to keep Arab and Jews who were against British colonization. Gad Crozer was studying a 70-year-old map and noticed one of 62 compounds didn't appear in any modern maps. Crozer published an article simply mentioning this missing compound, Meretz. A few days later, he received a phone call from the Israeli military asking why he didn't submit the article to them for inspection. It's believed the facility has been airbrushed from the aerial photos and purged from modern maps. The prison is dubbed the Israeli Guantanamo, while prisoners are blindfolded while leaving cells that are only 2 meters by 2 meters. There's absolutely no light coming into the cells, and the prison can be used to make people disappear without a trace. Israel claimed the prison's been out of action since 2006, but a number of requests by world governments to examine the facility since have been rejected. La Sabaneta, aka Maracaibo National Prison. Sabaneta is in Venezuela, has a capacity for 700 prisoners, but has a population of 3,700 prisoners. It was opened in 1958, but closed in 2013 and converted into a museum. Again, being in South America in a third world country, it was ran by the prisoners, and so are 80% of all prisons in Venezuela. In 1994, a group of prisoners started a fire to trap certain prisoners inside a block. A riot broke out, involving stabbings and shootings, and many trying to escape the fire. By the time the guards came and retook control, 150 were estimated dead. This riot is often cited as the deadliest prison riot of all time. The lack of control is evident, as in 2012 there were only 8 wardens on duty at a time. That's 462 prisoners per guard. 69 prisoners died that year as a result of violence, and this caused to the prison being closed. Because of the lack of control, the army would often have to come in and create some kind of order. They'd often confiscate huge stockpiles of drugs and weapons. One time when the army came in, they even discovered a huge collection of jungle animals that included a few endangered species. Scorpion jail. The Scorpion jail is a political prison in Egypt. Essentially, it's for oppositions of the Egyptian government. The prison was planned in 1991 and took heavy inspiration from US max security prisons. The prison took 2 years to build, and it was designed in a way so that the cells didn't get any light whatsoever. Prisoners would also have to spend 24-hour confinement in their cells. It's also designed so that water and electricity can be cut from any cell at any time. The walls are corroding away from the humidity inside the prison, and the small 2 meter by 3 meter cells squeeze 3 people in. There's barely any space to fit a bed and a toilet, let alone 3 extra people. On to the bottom of the list. Now, Unit 731 that sits in this unit alone definitely deserves this spot on their own. It's definitely the most inhumane prison I've ever read about. Now, Unit 731 was used by the Japanese in World War II. Although a very proud nation, steeped in many traditions, such as martial arts, this era is a very dark part of Japan's history. In 1925, the Geneva Convention banned chemical weapons, so Japan needed somewhere to develop these weapons behind closed doors. The prison was made to be a completely secret unit, and you can only really imagine some of the experiments that would go on. Other experiments tested on human beings would be experiments such as frostbite testing. Scientists would take captives outside, dipping various limbs into freezing cold water of various temperatures, allowing their limbs to freeze. Once limbs were frozen, they would get smashed with sticks, and then the ice would be chipped away, and the affected area was subject to different treatments, such as being doused in boiling water, lit on fire, etc., etc. I don't quite know what they were doing here. Were they trying to find a cure for frostbite? You could only assume so, but to me it just sounds like torture. Another area of study in the prison was syphilis. Guards would force sex acts between infected and non-infected prisoners, forcing the disease to be spread quickly around the prison. After people were infected, they would be dissected during various stages of their infection, so that their internal and external organs could be observed as the disease progressed. As well as the forced sexual acts to spread syphilis, they would also force sexual acts to experiment on pregnant women and fetuses. Although it's clear a large number of babies were born in captivity, there's no accounts of any people born in Unit 731 ever surviving. In fact, there's no accounts of any survivors from Unit 731. As well as being a prison and a test facility for biological weapons on human beings, It was also a mass weapon factory for other biological and chemical weapons that, once researched and tested and deemed good enough, they would be mass produced. These biological weapons were used in areas of China that were not occupied by Japanese forces, which would include Chinese cities, towns, and even dumped in Chinese water sources. It's estimated that those killed inside Unit 31 and from Unit 31 related programs would range up to 500,000 people. Some pretty horrifying prisons there. And I want to thank the MahinoDetective user on the subreddit for making this iceberg. Very interesting to research it, and I hope you found it interesting watching.